Okay, the Crusades are back in the news, to which I must opine. Peter Hegseth, Donald Trump's pick to lead the incoming Department of Defense, is apparently a Crusader fanboy. That's an actual quote from one of the media attacks on him. He likes the Crusades. He speaks well about the Crusades. He has Crusader type tattoos, including the Crusader cross, as well as the Latin phrase Deus vult, which means God wills it, and we'll get to that in a moment. But because of all that, he is under attack by the media. And that's important for three specific reasons. The first has to do with what I call fake history. Fake history, just like fake news, is all about poisoning your understanding about current events, etc., etc. But in a way, it's possibly even worse and has far-reaching consequences as compared to its more temporal corollary, fake news. Fake history creates an overarching narrative that's false, a false first premise, and then everything that happens thereafter, including current events, such as what we'll get into, becomes poisoned because of the first premise, the history is fake. So, the New York Times, for example, that's probably one of the biggest places that wrote a hit piece on him, published an op-ed called Peter Hegseth and His Battle Cry for a New Christian Crusade. And the entire piece, of course, doesn't define what the Crusades were about, except in a negative sense. It offers all these negative connotations. They were full of atrocities. You get the idea that Muslims were peaceful and just these evil crusaders decided to come overseas and attack and colonize, etc., etc. And they don't have to do a lot of homework, and they don't even have to say that, because that is the prevalent interpretation nowadays of the Crusades. So among other things, the New York Times defines the Crusades as, quote, campaigns that featured so many atrocities and, quote, a shameful stain on the region or religion's history. All right. So I've already talked about the Crusades a lot. Basically, they are among the most warranted wars of history, because right before the Crusades, Muslims were completely annihilating and destroying and committing all sorts of atrocities against Christians. We forget that the First Crusade came 4 centuries after Muslims had conquered through violence, through the sword, about 3/4 of formerly Christian territory, which is North Africa and the Middle East. And also Spain was conquered at that time, and later the Eastern Europe and the Balkans, etc., etc. But right before the Crusades, not only had a huge chunk of former Christendom been conquered, but it was one of the most violent manifestations at that time. I speak of the Seljuk Turks, who were running amok in Asia Minor, Anatolia, today Turkey, but also in the Holy Land, committing non-stop atrocities that are mind-boggling. I have them in my book if you're interested, Sword and Scimitar. It's all documented and right there. But that's what provoked Pope Urban II in 1095 at the Council of Clermont to call for the First Crusade. And he described what was happening to Eastern Christians and the atrocities and churches being destroyed. Literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Christians were either slaughtered from between 1071 and 1095, when the First Crusade was called, and thousands of churches burned, ransacked, and or turned into mosques. Okay, so that's what prompted the First Crusade. But because that's not known, and everyone's been taught that the Crusades are these evil, unwarranted, white patriarchal sort of ventures, they can get away with demonizing a fellow like Hegseth just because he likes the Crusades and he has these Crusader tattoos. So that's the first point. Because of the fake history that dominates concerning the Crusades, someone who just likes the Crusades because they were noble and just by and large, at least their motivation, can now be demonized, someone like Hegseth. And obviously a lot of people, which leads to the second point. But all the articles and op-eds and hit pieces I saw that emanated, including the New York Times, try to connect those who like the Crusades, such as Hegseth, as being white supremacists. So that's proof positive that you are a white supremacist, you have a Crusader tattoo, or you've spoken well about the Crusades. Well, that overlooks the reality of why that is. Certainly it's true. Crusaders were white Europeans and their enemies were brownish Muslims, right? But beyond that fact, which people obsess over, is why that was the case. Because when, as I was speaking about the conquest of the larger part of Christendom in the 7th century. All of North Africa and the Middle East, which was Christian, got conquered. So the peoples who were not European, from Egypt and Syria and Morocco and North Africa, which was the older Christian region, those people were conquered, subdued. Many converted to Islam, many lived as dhimmis, but they couldn't fight back. So the reason that it was white peoples, Europeans, who actually fought the Muslims is because they were all that was left. Europe was the final bastion of Christendom, and even parts of it, as I mentioned, had already been conquered. Spain and occupied for many centuries, for example. So the reality is, yes, it's true. There was a dichotomy, a racial one, if you like, with the Crusaders being overwhelmingly white, European, etc., and their enemies being the opposite. But that has nothing to do with the race itself. That's not why they attacked them. The point is, when they say so and so is a white supremacist because he likes the Crusades, they're trying to manipulate this fact into making you think that the Crusaders were racist. That's why they went and attacked these brown, peaceful Muslims. In other words, the reason that it was whites and Europeans who led the Crusades has nothing to do with race, but rather all that was left of free Christendom was peopled by whites. But of course, nowadays, none of that matters. The history I just mentioned, the conquest of North Africa and the Middle East, and the fact that all that was left were the peoples of Europe doesn't matter. All that is seen today via the identity politics lens is the colors of both participants. So you have whites fighting non-whites, and based on the predominant formula, that means that the former, the whites, are the bad guys, and the latter, the Muslims, the non-whites, are the innocent victims. In reality, this is just another way, name-calling, white supremacism, to make people veer away from liking or being appreciative of the Crusades. But like I said, the Crusades were amongst the most just wars of all time. And people who are inclined to justice may favor them and like them and be supportive of them, such as, I assume, Hegseth. But now they're all dismissed as white supremacists. And under this logic, I, your friendly neighborhood Mr. Ibrahim, am also a white supremacist. The final point, probably the most subtle, is that in all the pieces that I read, the New York Times and so forth, and I've seen this a lot, whenever you get someone who understands the Crusades correctly, the way we're discussing it, and maybe even holds a favorable view of the Crusades, they always have this sort of yes, but approach. Yeah, the Crusades were important, but yeah, there were terrible atrocities, etc., etc. In fact, I think in one of the articles in New York Times, maybe they quoted Hegseth to that effect, where he likes the Crusades, but he went out of his way to tell you, no, of course they had mega atrocities, etc., etc. And so did a lot of other scholars and historians, good ones, also quoted in these pieces. Hegseth, for example, is quoted in, I believe, the New York Times as saying, even though the Crusades were important, they still were full of injustices, quote, I'm quoting him now, quote, injustices and unspeakable tragedy. All right, okay. So the problem with this position, which is spoken by Hegseth and other people, many other people who support and believe the Crusades was a good thing, is that it raises an important question. What war was not full of atrocities and unspeakable tragedies? Every single war that I know of is inundated with injustices and unspeakable tragedies. And the Crusades went on for well over 2 centuries, at least in the Holy Land, and longer elsewhere. So one would expect there would be some injustices and unspeakable tragedies. And yet, we don't say that. We don't begin discussions of other wars by noting that. Every single war, you can think of the most romanticized wars of patriotic lore, including the American Revolution, World War I, Civil War, and you will find tons of atrocities committed by the good guys. But who now, for example, speaks and says that World War II, America's role in World War II was problematic because, don't you know, American GIs raped about 15,000 women in England and France and Germany, right? We don't do that. People introduce America's role in World War II as questionable, something that we really have to do a lot of hemming and hawing about and wringing our hands about because of this unfortunate fact, the rape of 15,000 women? They don't. And they don't do it about any other wars. So why is it always and only for the Crusades that we have to wring our hands and apologize and offer all these caveats and equivocate about the meaning of the Crusades. It was like those other wars. Yeah, bad things happened. But I would argue a lot better things happened. At least the motivation behind it was nobler and just, as opposed to so many modern wars that are not introduced in this way as these bad, horrible things that we must always keep in our mind. So my position is not that bad things didn't happen, but rather let's be consistent. Either from now on, when you speak about any war, you have to wring your hands and talk about how horrible the atrocities were, just like with the Crusades, or else don't single them out to some sort of special standard that no one has ever met. Anyway, there it is. My 2 cents, or rather my 3 points, on the recent attack on the concept of the crusade in the context of Pete Hegseth. All right, bye.